It's the year 64 CE. A naked woman staggers down the uneven cobblestone streets of Rome, her skin smeared with filth and streaked with fresh, open wounds. Chains bite into her wrists as she's dragged forward, and the roar of thousands fills the air. A sound not of sympathy, but of pure, savage excitement. They want blood. But what's waiting for her inside the Colosseum makes all of this seem almost merciful. Now, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you will completely rewrite what you think you know about Roman civilization. By the end of this story, you'll see why modern historians have tried to bury this part of history for centuries, and why some still refuse to even acknowledge it. I'm about to uncover 3 truths that are going to stay with you long after this ends. First, how Rome turned the act of execution into the most obscene form of sexual entertainment imaginable. Second, the one crime that guaranteed this gruesome punishment. And third, why emperors not only watched these horrors unfold, but sometimes took part in them. But before I go there, you need to hear this. Nobody talks about what really happened during Rome's most depraved public spectacle. If you think you can stomach the truth about how dark human nature can get, then brace yourself, because what comes next will forever change the way you look at ancient Rome, and maybe even our own world. You've probably heard about Roman brutality, the gladiators, the blood-soaked arenas, the endless fights to the death. But that was just the sideshow. The true nightmare was reserved for women who dared to speak out, to rebel, or sometimes just to exist in the wrong man's shadow. Picture it. The Roman Empire at its peak, somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. Rome rules over half the known world, its cities covered in marble, its laws shaping societies even today. On the surface, it's the height of civilization. But under all that beauty and order was something darker, something far more twisted than simple execution. Rome had perfected the art of humiliation. They turned sexual violence into a weapon of control, a kind of psychological warfare that went beyond death itself. You see, killing someone wasn't enough for the empire. They wanted to send a message, one that would echo through every street, every household, and every terrified mind that might ever think about defying Roman power. Public executions were never just punishments. They were theater performances meant to break not only the body, but the very soul of the condemned. And here's what the history books often leave out. Rome didn't just kill women. They annihilated them. Physically, emotionally, publicly, transforming their suffering into entertainment for a hungry crowd. This wasn't chaos or random cruelty. It was a system, honed over generations, perfected by emperors who knew that fear of sexual humiliation could control millions. And the worst part? People loved it. Men, women, children, entire families would fill the arenas to cheer as women were stripped, violated, and tortured in slow, deliberate agony. But even that wasn't the main event. What happened before the arena was a show of its own. The procession through the streets, that was just the warm-up. Now, imagine standing in those streets yourself. The air reeks of sweat, rotten food, and something else. Fear mixed with excitement. The crowd grows louder, bodies pressing closer together, waiting for the spectacle to begin. Then you hear it. The metallic clinking of chains echoing off the stone walls. Guards drag a naked woman through the forum, her head down, her skin raw. Her so-called crime could be anything: adultery, treason, or simply refusing the wrong man's advances. This punishment was called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But before she ever reached the animals, she faced something far worse. The Roman poet Martial described scenes that historians conveniently ignored for centuries. He wrote about how crowds hurled human waste, rotting vegetables, and jagged stones at the women being paraded to their deaths. But even that wasn't the cruelest part. The guards made sure the route through the city was deliberate, not random. They stopped at temples where the woman once prayed, outside homes where her family lived, through markets where she had once been just another face in the crowd. Why? Because Rome understood that true punishment wasn't just death. It was erasing every trace of your dignity, your identity, before you even stopped breathing. They weren't just killing a person. They were erasing her existence, wiping her memory from the community she once belonged to. Martial even wrote about one woman who tried to cover her body with her hands, and the guards broke her fingers for it. Another tried to collapse to the ground to hide herself, but they dragged her back up, forcing her to keep walking, forcing her to face the mob. And here's the part that still haunts me. Families were expected to show up for these events. Roman parents actually brought their kids to watch the parades, calling it education, a lesson in what happens when you dare to stand against Roman law. Imagine that. A mother holding her son's hand as they both watch another woman being dragged through the streets, beaten and broken, and calling it moral instruction. Sometimes, the condemned woman's own family would be in the crowd. Her father, her brother, even her children, forced to throw stones at her to prove their loyalty to Rome. Because if they showed even a hint of compassion, they'd be next. And the guards who led the procession, they weren't just soldiers carrying out orders. These men were specialists trained in the art of psychological destruction. They knew exactly when to stop and let the crowd scream, exactly how long to make her stand there, trembling and exposed. They even knew which parts of her body to reveal first, how to drag out every ounce of humiliation before she was finally allowed to die. But that march through the city, that was only the beginning. What waited for her inside the arena would make everything before it look like mercy. Don't look away now, because what happened next is darker than anything you've heard so far. When the gates of the arena slammed shut behind her, the noise of the crowd was deafening. 50,000 Romans, shouting, laughing, clapping, like it was a sporting event. But this wasn't about lions or gladiators fighting for honor. This was about turning a woman's final, terrified moments into a twisted form of sexual theater. Here's what most history books skip over. Roman executions weren't swift. They were drawn-out, choreographed scenes of suffering. Women were often forced to act out mythological rape stories before they were killed, dressed as figures from legend. Europa violated by Zeus disguised as a bull. Leda assaulted by the swan. But these weren't symbolic plays or harmless dramatizations. The Romans made them literal. Trained animals were used to attack, to assault, to degrade the women while the crowd roared in delight. The historian Cassius Dio even wrote about Empress Messalina, condemned not for adultery, but for being too powerful. Her punishment became a public performance. First, they stripped her naked before the Senate, her body trembling under their gaze. Then they forced her to crawl across the arena floor while senators and citizens threw objects and shouted insults. But even that was just the pre-show. Then came what the Romans called supplicia, a word that doesn't just mean punishment. It meant the complete and systematic destruction of a human being's dignity before death. The Romans brought in animals specifically trained for these acts. Bears, bulls, even horses, creatures conditioned to attack humans in the most depraved ways imaginable. And while this horror unfolded, the crowd didn't flinch. They ate, they laughed, they applauded. And here's the part nobody talks about. The crowd wasn't just watching. They were participating. The audience could vote on what should happen next. Thumbs up meant more torment. Thumbs down meant a quicker end, which almost never happened. Mothers pointed out the techniques to their daughters, warning them how to avoid such a fate. Fathers told their sons to listen closely to the screams, calling them lessons in control and power. And up in the emperor's box, the ruler of the known world watched with the best seat in the house. This wasn't just cruelty for entertainment's sake. It was political theater. A public lesson in who held the power and what happened when you forgot it. Every drop of blood was a reminder that Rome ruled not just through laws, but through fear. And maybe the most horrifying part of all, some of these women were still alive when the animals were done. The crowd would demand that they stay conscious, screaming, aware, as executioners slowly tore them apart, limb by limb. But as unthinkable as that sounds, there was one kind of woman who faced something even worse. If you think you've already heard the most horrific part, you haven't. Because the story of the Vestal Virgins makes everything else sound almost merciful. Now imagine the holiest women in Rome, the Vestal Virgins. Priestesses who kept the eternal flame burning, believed to protect the very life of the empire itself. They were untouchable, revered, even more respected than most senators, until the day one of them broke her vow of chastity. When that happened, Rome faced a terrible dilemma. Killing a sacred priestess could offend the gods, but letting her crime go unpunished could shake the empire's moral foundation. So they came up with something even worse than death, a punishment designed to terrify an entire civilization. Here's how it went. First, they stripped the Vestal Virgin naked, not in private but in front of the entire Senate. Not quickly either. Slowly, deliberately, while senators debated her fate like it was a philosophical exercise. She stood there, trembling, exposed, surrounded by men who claimed to serve the gods. Hours passed before anyone even moved, and that was just the beginning. Historian Pliny the Younger wrote about what happened to the Vestal Virgins under Emperor Domitian, but his letters were hidden for centuries. In those writings, he describes how the Romans took their so-called justice to horrifying extremes. The Vestals, once sacred symbols of purity, were beaten with rods until their skin split open, all while being kept painfully awake. But that was only the beginning. The real horror came next. These women were buried alive, not in a normal grave, but in something designed for slow, conscious suffering. The Vestal would be lowered into a sealed underground chamber, just deep enough to keep her isolated from the world, but close enough that her screams could still be heard above ground. They left her a flickering oil lamp, a small loaf of bread, and a cup of water. Not enough to live, just enough to keep her alive longer. The walls around her were lined with shattered pottery, so if she tried to claw her way out, she'd shred her fingers down to the bone. Every single detail was engineered for psychological torment. And here's the part that will stay with you. People could hear her cries for days, sometimes weeks. Families would gather above the chamber to listen, calling it a religious ceremony. Pliny even tells of one Vestal who lasted 18 days in the dark. 18 days of hunger, madness, and the echo of her own voice bouncing off the stone walls around her. But the cruelty didn't stop there. If by some miracle she survived, the Romans would declare it divine intervention, and then execute her anyway, accusing her of corrupting the ritual by continuing to live. Emperor Domitian himself oversaw the design of those chambers. He personally visited construction sites to make sure the acoustics carried the screams properly. He called it architectural theology, using sound as proof of divine justice. And this wasn't an isolated obsession. The emperors made it personal. What I'm about to tell you next shows just how far Roman depravity went when absolute power met complete moral decay. Here's the truth most historians gloss over. The emperors didn't just approve of these rituals. They designed them. They participated in them. They turned sexual humiliation into their private form of entertainment. Take Emperor Caligula, for example. He didn't just attend executions, he choreographed them. He treated them like elaborate theater productions, planning every moment of a woman's suffering with the precision of a stage director. He worked alongside architects, animal trainers, and torture experts, inventing new ways to make human pain into spectacle. And if that's not disturbing enough, he invited foreign ambassadors to watch. Envoys from Egypt, Germania, Britannia, all forced to witness Rome's creativity. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was psychological warfare. A message to the world. This is what happens when you defy Rome. Caligula even had a private arena built beneath his palace, a place where he could test new methods of torture away from the public eye. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting he experimented on enslaved women there before unveiling his innovations in front of the crowd. Then came Emperor Nero, who took things even further. He would dress as a gladiator, enter the arena himself, and personally assault condemned women in front of tens of thousands. The crowd called it divine justice, cheering while their emperor turned human suffering into performance art. And here's the most chilling part. This wasn't insanity. This was policy. Sexual humiliation had become a tool of statecraft. When foreign queens or noblewomen defied Roman rule, they weren't just executed. Their degradation was publicized across the empire as a warning. Rome ruled through terror, and humiliation was its sharpest weapon. The consequences rippled far beyond the empire's borders. Other nations began changing their own laws about women, not out of compassion but fear. Treaties included special clauses promising the preservation of dignity for captured queens or noblewomen. No one wanted to give Rome an excuse to turn them into public entertainment. It got so bad that the empire actually created government positions dedicated to inventing new torments. There was even an official title, the Magistrate of Public Degradation. It came with a salary, benefits, and the authority to design spectacles of suffering. But then, something started to shift. A new religion began spreading, Christianity. And slowly, people started to question whether their so-called entertainment was moral at all. It didn't happen overnight. The games continued for decades after the first conversions. But over time, the crowds began to thin. By the 4th century, emperors found themselves performing to half-empty arenas. Rome didn't stop these spectacles because of mercy. They stopped because nobody wanted to watch anymore. The appetite for cruelty had finally burned itself out. Yet here's what should unsettle you most. It took 300 years of Christian influence to end practices that had been seen as normal, even educational. The machinery of sexual humiliation was so deeply built into Roman culture that it lasted longer than the gladiator fights, longer than the wild animal hunts, longer than almost any other part of Rome's public entertainment. And when archaeologists later uncovered private Roman homes, they found frescoes, paintings of these executions, decorating dining rooms and courtyards. Families had literally turned torture into home decor. Violence wasn't just public policy. It was domestic art. So what does that tell us about humanity, about civilization, about how thin the line really is between order and barbarism? Rome's legacy of institutionalized sexual violence proves something terrifying. Any society, no matter how advanced, can normalize the unthinkable if it serves those in power. What we've just explored wasn't a story of individual madness. It was systemic, bureaucratic, and socially accepted evil. And here's what should keep you up at night. Public shaming hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. We still destroy people in public, only now it happens online. Social media mobs, viral humiliation, coordinated harassment campaigns, it's the same impulse dressed in digital clothing. The Romans believed they were civilized as they cheered for sexual torture. So what are we convincing ourselves of today? What forms of entertainment are we consuming that future generations might call barbaric? What kinds of humiliation have we normalized without even realizing it? I want to hear what you think. What other so-called civilized societies have used sexual humiliation to keep control? And more importantly, where do you see echoes of Rome in the modern world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that subscribe button for more hidden truths history tried to erase. And I'll see you next week, when we dig into another dark secret the past tried to bury.